There are stories whispered in the shadows of history, stories so meticulously buried that even those who lived through them dared not speak aloud. Tonight, I'm going to open one of those graves. And once I do, you won't be able to close it again. Over the course of just 25 years in 19th century Pennsylvania, a single man, wealthy industrialist Jeremiah Hartwell, married 5 different women, each of them beautiful, intelligent, and full of life. And each of them, without exception, suffered the exact same fate. Within months of moving into his grand estate on Beacon Hill, their minds began to unravel, not slowly, not naturally, but with an almost mechanical precision, like a process being followed to the letter. It would take years before the truth came out in 1835, and when it did, it didn't merely shock the quiet town of Millbrook, it rattled the entire state of Pennsylvania, because what investigators uncovered was not a tragic coincidence, nor the work of some family curse. It was something far more deliberate, a hidden mechanism designed to break the human mind. Specifically, the minds of women who lived in one particular room of the Hartwell mansion. The house still stands. If you walked past it today, you might think it's nothing more than a relic of a prosperous age, a place where fortunes were made and society thrived. But the walls have absorbed screams you will never hear, and the mirrors, oh the mirrors, have reflected far more than faces. I'm not here to tell you a ghost story. I'm here to tell you about control, the kind that doesn't just dominate a person's actions, but invades their thoughts, twists their identity, and turns reality itself into a weapon. You'll see how it works, step by step. And by the time you realize what Hartwell was doing, you'll also realize something else. The same methods are still being used today, though in more subtle forms. So listen carefully, because if you recognize the pattern early enough, you can protect yourself from it. But if you don't, once the process starts, it's almost impossible to reverse. Now, let's go back to where it began, in the coal-rich valleys of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where Jeremiah Hartwell first arrived in 1821. A young man with charm in his voice, steel in his gaze, and a hunger for control that would shape the destiny and destroy the sanity of every woman who dared to love him. Millbrook, Pennsylvania in 1821 was not the kind of place where great empires were built. It was a farming town, sleepy, predictable, until the Industrial Revolution began to creep through the valley like smoke curling under a locked door. Coal was discovered, railroads were planned, and factories rose along the Monongah River. And with that transformation came a new breed of man, men who didn't just want wealth, but domination. Jeremiah Hartwell was one of them. He arrived at 25, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of cold steel and hair already silvering at the temples. His father had been a blacksmith in rural Ohio, and Hartwell carried the blacksmith's relentlessness, only now the iron he intended to shape was human. He studied people the way some men studied machinery. He knew how to make them feel important, understood what to say to earn their trust, and, more importantly, what to withhold to keep them wanting more. Within 5 years, he had founded Hartwell Iron Works, manufacturing railroad components critical to America's westward expansion. His business success was meteoric, but it was his personal magnetism that cemented his place in Millbrook's highest circles. By 1828, his fortune was solid, and so he built his fortress, the Hartwell Mansion. Perched on Beacon Hill, it rose 3 stories high, 42 rooms of imported marble, hand-painted French wallpaper, and manicured gardens that spilled across the hillside. But the jewel of the house, the one room visitors always remembered, was the master bedroom suite in the east wing. It was bathed in morning light, anchored by a towering cherrywood bed, and adorned with mirrors, large, ornate, placed so you could not cross the room without catching your reflection from multiple angles. The bedroom would later become the axis of everything. When Hartwell announced his engagement to 19-year-old Margaret Dunlap, daughter of a respected judge, society rejoiced. It was a perfect match, youth and beauty joined with wealth and influence. The wedding in October 1829 was the event of the decade. But no one in that glittering crowd suspected that Margaret's story would be the first in a grim sequence, one that would be repeated with chilling precision. Her decline began so quietly that even her family missed the signs. But in hindsight, it was clear. The house had begun its work. And if you think it was just bad luck or fragile nerves, keep listening. You'll see exactly how it was done. Margaret's transformation was not the kind that announces itself with a scream in the night. Notes was slower, more insidious, the kind of change you only notice when it's too late to reverse. In the months after the wedding, she was still the radiant young bride Millbrook expected to see, but small shifts began to surface. At social gatherings where she once spoke with a quick wit and an easy laugh, she now grew distracted, her gaze wandering to some fixed point beyond the conversation. She stared out of windows with an intensity that unsettled her guests, as though watching something invisible to everyone else. Ew. Her sister Catherine wrote later in a private letter. She began speaking of the house as though it were alive, not in jest, but with a seriousness that chilled me. She would pause mid-sentence and turn toward an empty doorway, claiming she had heard her name called. When questioned, Margaret only smiled that strange closed-lip smile. "It's just the house settling," she would say softly. Old houses have their own language. By summer, her behavior was no longer subtle. She refused to sleep anywhere except the master bedroom, insisting the rest of the house felt wrong. And that was when the staff began to whisper about the watching habit. Margaret would stand for hours at the tall windows, not looking out at the gardens, not at the town below, but at her own reflection in the glass. Moving her head slowly from side to side, studying herself as if trying to catch her own face doing something it shouldn't. The breaking point came on a suffocating August evening in 1830. Hartwell was hosting a dinner for prominent Pittsburgh businessmen when Margaret, without a word, rose from her seat and walked to the dining room mirror. In front of dozens of stunned guests, she began an animated conversation with her reflection. She gestured emphatically, laughed in a high, unnatural pitch, and at one point asked, "Why do you look so tired?" pausing, as though listening to a reply only she could hear. When Jeremiah tried to lead her away, she resisted. "I'm not finished talking yet," she said firmly. That night, she was found in the master bedroom, completely naked, methodically stripping the French wallpaper from the walls, claiming she needed to see what was underneath. And what she found she never revealed. But the satisfaction on her face told the servants one thing: whatever it was, it mattered. The morning after the wallpaper incident, Dr. Harrison Henley, Millbrook's most respected physician, was summoned to the Hartwell mansion. He found Margaret seated calmly at the center of the stripped room, fragments of wallpaper piled neatly at her feet like shed skin. She was, in his clinical words, a young woman in excellent physical health, suffering from severe nervous exhaustion, complicated by obsessive melancholia. But those sterile words failed to capture the strangeness before him. Margaret spoke with poise, even grace, but her eyes rarely met his. Instead, they kept drifting toward the massive vanity mirror in the corner, as if waiting for it to confirm her answers. She told him she had discovered another Margaret there, another self who knew things about the house she could not possibly know. Henley's notes would later become crucial evidence. Patient demonstrates fixation with reflective surfaces, especially mirrors, with a belief that her reflection is a separate entity capable of imparting historical information about the premises. He underlined that last phrase twice. In the weeks that followed, her condition deteriorated with alarming precision. She moved from mirror to mirror, whispering to them, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. When the servants tried to cover them, she flew into a rage, clawing at the cloth until her fingers bled. She called the reflections the other Margarets and insisted they were her true family. Then came the night of September 15th, 1830. Somehow she gathered every mirror, every piece of polished silver, any object that could throw back her image, and arranged them in a complex circle in the master bedroom. The staff described it as a conference with her other selves that lasted until dawn. When Jeremiah entered the room that morning, Margaret looked directly at him and did not know who he was. She saw only the reflections. Henley, after consulting specialists in Philadelphia, recommended her commitment to the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. On a gray October morning, as autumn leaves swirled across Beacon Hill, Margaret was taken away in a closed carriage. She would never again set foot outside the asylum. For the next 43 years, she lived in a locked ward, endlessly seeking mirrors, whispering to them as if they still carried messages from home. Society saw a tragic case of fragile female nerves. Jeremiah Hartwell, the grieving husband. But there were whispers. Whispers that Margaret had found something hidden in that room, and that someone had made very sure she would never speak of it again. Margaret's removal from the mansion sent a shiver through Millbrook's upper class, but the ripples faded quickly. Society preferred simple explanations, and Dr. Henley's official report provided one. Overstimulation of the female nervous system caused by sudden elevation in social position and domestic responsibility. It was a convenient narrative, one that soothed polite company and absolved Jeremiah Hartwell of suspicion. The tragedy became a cautionary tale whispered at tea tables, a reminder of the delicate nature of a woman's mind. No one publicly asked why the deterioration had occurred so swiftly, or why it seemed so centered around a single room. For 3 years after Margaret's commitment, Hartwell lived as a widower in appearance, but not in spirit. He withdrew from society, yes, but not into grief. He withdrew into study. The master bedroom was sealed off, its furniture draped in white sheets, and Hartwell moved to a smaller room on the 3rd floor. Servants reported he spent long nights in his study, poring over medical journals, letters from European physicians, and obscure treatises on the human mind. This was not the idle distraction of a man nursing heartbreak. This was research. His private journals, uncovered decades later, revealed a chilling focus. He wrote about the science of mental affliction, with the dispassionate tone of a man examining the workings of a machine. He catalogued symptoms, triggers, environmental factors, like a chemist noting which combinations produced the strongest reactions. And always there were references to the suite, that east wing bedroom, the mirrors, the light, the arrangement of space. He wrote of them not as decorations, but as components. When word reached him in 1833 that Margaret had died, Hartwell attended her funeral with solemn dignity. The headstone bore a simple inscription, "Beloved wife at peace," but the journals from that period reveal no grief. Instead, they reveal preparation. By early 1834, he was speaking of marriage again, but not with the language of love. He described a suitable wife in terms of attributes, like an employer seeking a candidate for a position. Mental resilience, adaptability, and, most importantly, a capacity to maintain composure under strain, and soon he found her. Elena Rodriguez, 22, the daughter of a Spanish merchant with strong trading connections, intelligent, strikingly beautiful, and in Hartwell's private estimation, perfectly suited for the suite. Elena Rodriguez arrived on a crisp March afternoon in 1834, the carriage wheels grinding against the frost-hardened dirt road as the Hartwell mansion loomed into view. She carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to polite society, though her eyes lingered on the house longer than most brides. From the moment she crossed the threshold, Hartwell was watching her, not with the gaze of a smitten husband, but with the quiet scrutiny of a man measuring variables. Her steps across the marble foyer, the way she glanced at the chandelier's shifting light, the slight catch in her breath as they passed the east wing corridor, all of it was noted. Their wedding was swift and subdued, lacking the grand spectacle of his first marriage. Within days, Elena was installed in the suite, the same east wing bedroom Margaret had occupied. Hartwell's journals from that week read less like a honeymoon diary and more like the logbook of a laboratory experiment. Day 2, no signs of nervous agitation. Eyes adjust rapidly to shifting light patterns. Day 5 noted a prolonged stare into the mantel mirror after supper. Duration, 47 seconds. Day 9 reports a faint humming sound at night, claims it comes from the walls. Elena was a sharper mind than Margaret, and she adapted quickly to the routines of the house, but the suite had a way of reshaping its occupants. Servants whispered that Elena began waking in the middle of the night, standing barefoot before the largest mirror, murmuring in Spanish to her own reflection. When questioned by Hartwell, she laughed it off, saying she was speaking to her mother in dreams. But the laughter never reached her eyes. By midsummer, Elena had taken to keeping the curtains closed at all hours, claiming the sunlight bent the room strangely. Guests noticed her growing pallor, the way her hands trembled when lifting a teacup. Still, Hartwell made no move to relocate her. Quite the opposite. He encouraged her to become comfortable in the room, insisting it was at the heart of the house. On the night of August 3rd, the butler reported hearing a crash from the suite. When the door was forced open, Elena was found kneeling before the vanity, shards of glass scattered around her like frost. The central mirror had been smashed outward, not inward, its pieces glittering like teeth across the rug. She would not explain how it happened. After the mirror incident, Elena's decline was no longer gradual. It was a plummet. The servants whispered that the room itself was changing. Candles burned lower there, their flames guttering as if in a draught, though no window was open. The faint hum Elena once mentioned had grown louder, a constant vibration in the walls, like a swarm behind plaster. And always, the mirrors. Hartwell replaced the shattered glass within days, commissioning a new one from a Boston craftsman. It was larger than the last, framed in dark walnut, and hung so it reflected not just Elena, but the entire bed behind her. When she asked why it was necessary, Hartwell's reply was simple. A woman should always see herself as others do. From that point on, her days were patterned, deliberately so. Hartwell insisted she take her breakfast in the suite, forbade her from reading in any other room, and encouraged long hours of arrest in the chase before the window. At night, he lingered in the doorway, watching her as she drifted in and out of shallow, twitching sleep. The journals are chilling in their precision. Day 42, noted increased aversion to social gatherings, avoids eye contact, maintains fixed gaze at middle distance. Day 50, began speaking in fragmented phrases, possible auditory hallucinations. But Day 57, repeated the phrase as she's here 7 times before refusing supper. Who she was, Elena never said. By late September, the servants began finding small offerings around the suite, fresh flowers from the garden, folded silk scarves, even pieces of bread, left on the floor in front of the mirror as if to appease someone only Elena could see. On the morning of October 12th, the chambermaid found Elena in the corner, knees drawn to her chest, fingernails bloodied from scratching something into the floorboards. The words were in Spanish, ragged and uneven. No es mío el reflejo. The reflection is not mine. Oh. Within the week she was gone, removed quietly, without explanation, much like Margaret before her. The official word was a sudden illness of the mind. Hartwell sent no letters of apology to her family, no invitations to visit. The suite was cleaned, and within months, another woman would walk its threshold. By the winter of 1836, the town had learned to stop asking questions about the Hartwell household. 2 wives gone in less than 3 years, both under the same roof, both with minds unraveled into whispers and mutterings. It was the sort of coincidence that bred superstition. Yet Hartwell moved through society untouched, his charm intact, his reputation curiously unblemished. He was a widower, twice over, wealthy, well-spoken, and seemingly cursed by misfortune rather than malice. It was in this polished, unassailable state that he set his sights on Clara Winslow. Clara was younger than his previous wives, barely 19 when they wed. A minister's daughter from Providence, she possessed a kind of radiant naivete that Hartwell seemed to prize. She was quick to laugh, eager to please, and so trusting that she mistook his calculating silences for a thoughtful nature. From the first night, he placed her in the East Wing suite. Clara, unlike the others, did not balk at its strange proportions or the way sound seemed to carry there. She delighted in the tall windows, in the way the mirrors reflected the golden light of morning. Hartwell, of course, documented everything. Day 3, subject exhibits no immediate discomfort. Sleeps soundly, shows fascination with her own image. Day 7, encouraged increased time in front of the central mirror. Responds positively, laughs at small distortions in glass. Day 12, introduced controlled periods of isolation. Reports mild restlessness. The change came more quickly this time. By the 3rd week, Clara began complaining of a pale figure that appeared in the mirror only when she was alone. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. Then she insisted it was a woman with hair like hers, but a face she could not quite recognize. Hartwell never dismissed these claims. He encouraged them. He told her that the house was old, that its walls remember, and that it was only natural for certain rooms to hold on to their former occupants. Her laughter grew thinner with each passing day. She began wearing veils indoors, draping them over her hair and shoulders so the figure in the mirror could not mimic her. The maids, terrified, started refusing to clean the room after sunset. And then came the night of the first incident. Here, it was just past midnight when a scream shattered the stillness. The staff rushed to find Clara standing before the largest mirror, her hands pressed flat to its surface, eyes wide in terror. "She wants to come through," she whispered. "She says there's room for one of us on the other side." Oh. Hartwell's journal entry for that night was chilling in its brevity. Day 29, breakthrough. From the moment Hartwell wrote the word breakthrough, Clara's life was no longer her own. Her meals were brought exclusively to the suite now, silver trays left on a small table by the door, collected untouched hours later. Hartwell told the staff she was arresting and mustn't be disturbed, but behind those locked doors, he was tightening the threads of her reality like a noose. He began controlling the light, curtains drawn for days at a time, then flung open without warning, so the winter sun glared directly into the mirrors, forcing her to squint, disoriented. On some nights, he replaced every candle in the room with shorter ones, so they burned out far sooner than she expected, plunging her into darkness before she was ready. The mirrors were always there. Hartwell added a fourth, smaller one near the dressing table, angled just so that Clara's reflection seemed to watch her from behind whenever she sat down. The journal entries became clinical, detached, as though he were describing an animal's behavior rather than a human's. Day 34 reports that reflection moves a fraction slower than her own gestures, appears unsettled. Day 38 began conversing aloud with reflection, recorded 4 distinctive voices on dialogue. Day 41 attempted to cover mirrors with fabric, removed coverings while she slept. Clara's appearance began to shift. Her cheeks hollowed, her lips cracked from whispering to the glass for hours on end. She claimed the pale figure had a name now, though she refused to speak it, insisting that names make doors. By early February, her voice had become so hoarse she could barely speak above a rasp. She carried a small shard of broken glass in her sleeve, saying she needed a way back if the other side took her too far. Then came the night Hartwell recorded simply as the demonstration. The servants heard it before they saw it, a strange high-pitched keening sound that seemed to come from every wall at once. When they forced the door open, Clara was standing in front of the largest mirror, her face inches from its surface, breathing so heavily the glass was fogged. Her reflection was smiling. She was not. The night of the demonstration marked the final stage. Hartwell had always been careful with his experiments, never rushing, never forcing too much at once. But with Clara, something in him had shifted. He seemed almost eager. That evening, the house was unusually silent. The servants had been given the night off, except for 2 who were ordered to remain in the kitchen, forbidden to leave. Hartwell brought Clara a decanter of wine, poured her a single glass, and sat across from her in the East Wing suite. "You've been speaking to her again," he said calmly. Clara nodded, her eyes glassy. "She says she's closer now. She says it's warmer where she is. Hartwell leaned forward, voice low. "And do you want to go to her?" A long silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, Clara nodded again. Hartwell rose, walked to the largest mirror, and with a slow, deliberate motion, wiped a cloth across its surface. The glass seemed unnaturally clear, so much so that the reflection felt less like a copy and more like a doorway. "Stand here," he instructed. Clara obeyed, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling at her sides. Hartwell stepped back, watching with a predator's patience. In the glass, her reflection tilted its head, but Clara did not. The reflection's lips began to move, forming words she clearly heard but no one else could. Tears welled in her eyes. She reached toward the glass. For a heartbeat, her hand stopped just shy of touching it, and then, without hesitation, she pressed her palm flat against the surface. The room temperature dropped instantly. Hartwell wrote later that the air thickened, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Her reflection smiled again, wider this time, and laid its own palm against hers, except when the glass should have blocked it. The hand in the mirror pushed through. The surface rippled like water. What happened next was quick, but not quick enough to erase from memory. The reflection seized Clara's wrist and yanked. She screamed, a single sharp cry, before her entire body was pulled into the mirror, vanishing with a violent ripple. The glass still. Only Hartwell remained, staring at his own reflection, which smiled back at him, though he was not smiling at all. By dawn, Hartwell had transformed the scene into something entirely different. The mirrors were shrouded in heavy black cloth, the curtains drawn, the bed made with military precision. A traveling trunk stood near the door, half packed with Clara's belongings, neatly folded dresses, a hairbrush, and a stack of unopened letters from her family. The official story was simple. Clara had suffered a nervous collapse and been sent to a private clinic in the countryside for a rest. A carriage was seen leaving the estate in the early hours, its curtains drawn. No one saw Clara inside. No one could prove she wasn't there. The servants, of course, whispered. Some claimed they'd heard her screams echoing down the East Wing hallway. Others swore they'd glimpsed her pale face in the upper windows days later, long after the carriage had departed. Hartwell ignored them all. In his private study, locked behind 2 iron bolts, he sat before the largest mirror, now bare again, turning the pages of his leather-bound journal. His notes on Clara were meticulous, more so than any of the wives before her. Subject retained individuality for 41 days post-transition. Observed partial synchronization between host and counterpart. Breakthrough, reciprocal interaction through glass without intermediary tool. With 41, he underlined breakthrough twice. This was not grief, it was data. Clara had not been his wife. She had been an experiment, one in a series. The others too, Eliza, Margaret, Anne, Lydia, each had been a step towards something. In the final page of this section of the journal, he sketched something the size of a doorway, a mirror taller than a man, its surface ringed with strange geometric patterns and letters from no language the reader might recognize. Beneath it, in sharp, deliberate ink, he wrote, 5 keys, 1 lock. The threshold will open. For weeks after Clara's departure, Hartwell avoided the East Wing entirely, not out of fear, he claimed, but because the space had become energetically volatile. He spent most of his time in the library now, surrounded by manuscripts so ancient they crumbled at the touch. Some were written on vellum, others on paper so blackened by age that ink had to be read under candlelight from a specific angle. Many were in languages even the most learned scholars of the era would have dismissed as gibberish. Each night, Hartwell returned to the same passage in a tattered leather-bound grimoire. A depiction of a figure standing before an arched mirror, hands pressed to the glass, has something behind the reflection pressed back. The text beneath was in a sharp, angular script, but Hartwell had long since translated it. The threshold is not a portal to the dead, it is a seam between 2 living worlds. One breathes light, the other waits in shadow. His notes had grown more erratic since Clara. Words scrawled over words, diagrams layered on top of one another, numbers that seemed less like calculations and more like dates. Servants reported hearing him speaking in low tones to the shrouded mirrors, sometimes answering himself in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own. At night, the house seemed to respond. Doors swelled in their frames, window panes bowed inward, as if under some unseen pressure. And always, the mirrors, even covered, they sometimes pulsed faintly in the dark, their cloth coverings shifting without a draught. A maid swore she saw fingerprints pressing up from beneath the fabric in the east wing, dragging slowly downward, as if whatever was inside the glass wanted out. In his final entry for that month, Hartwell wrote, 4 taken. 1 remains. When the 5th key turns, the glass will not hold. The arrival of Hartwell's 5th wife, Eleanor, was different from the others. She did not come to the estate in a flurry of wedding announcements or public celebration. There was no church ceremony, no gathering of well-wishers. One rainy evening, a covered carriage simply appeared at the front gates, and by morning, Eleanor was seen walking the halls as though she had always lived there. She was young, perhaps too young, and striking in a way that unsettled the servants. Her dark hair fell in unbroken sheets. Her eyes were a pale gray that seemed almost colorless, and her voice was so soft that people often leaned in to hear, only to find she had stopped speaking and was simply watching them. Unlike the other wives, Eleanor rarely left Hartwell's side. She joined him in the library late into the night, paging through the same crumbling tomes, pausing on diagrams that resembled the great mirror in the East Wing. Sometimes they spoke in low voices, sometimes they didn't speak at all, merely standing before the shrouded glass for long, silent stretches. The townsfolk began to notice. Shopkeepers whispered that Hartwell had been buying unusual supplies, large quantities of salt, rare mineral powders, silver filings, and oils used in ceremonial rites. A farmer swore he saw a group of men carrying an enormous crate into the estate under the cover of darkness, its surface stenciled with symbols that made his skin crawl. By the 2nd month of Eleanor's arrival, more than one villager claimed to have seen strange lights flickering in the windows of the East Wing. Not candlelight, something sharper, bluer, like lightning trapped behind the glass. Inside the estate, the servants began to quit, one by one. Those who remained avoided the East Wing entirely, crossing themselves as they passed its corridor. They spoke of muffled voices that came not from behind the walls, but from inside the mirrors themselves. Eleanor seemed to thrive in this atmosphere. Her pale eyes grew sharper, her voice stronger. And Hartwell, Though thinner, his face gaunt from sleepless nights, moved with a purpose none had ever seen before. One evening, a chambermaid passing by the east wing swore she heard Eleanor say something in a voice that was not her own. "The fifth key is ready." The days leading up to the ritual were unlike anything the Hartwell estate had seen before. The air itself seemed to change, thicker somehow, heavy with a metallic tang that coated the back of the throat. Birds no longer perched on the windowsills. The gardens, once manicured to perfection, began to wilt as though the soil had been poisoned. Even the ever-present wind off the moors seemed to avoid the house, skirting it in unnatural stillness. Eleanor moved through these days like a shadow in human form. She no longer spoke to the servants at all, and when she walked, her skirts barely seemed to disturb the air. Hartwell kept to the library, but his notes were no longer the frantic scrawl of obsession. They were methodical, precise, like a general planning a siege. Rumors in the village reached a fever pitch. Someone claimed to have seen Hartwell in the graveyard after midnight, digging with bare hands at the earth. Another swore they found dead livestock arranged in patterns in the fields near the estate, spirals and rings that mirrored the diagrams in Hartwell's older notebooks. On the night before the ritual, every mirror in the house, large and small, even the ones in servant quarters, was uncovered. The servants who remained huddled in the kitchen, refusing to go upstairs, yet they could feel the change in the air as midnight approached. The house seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated through the floorboards and into their bones. From the east wing came the sound of something moving, not footsteps, but a slow, deliberate dragging, as though something heavy was being pulled across the floor. At exactly midnight, the servants heard Eleanor's voice, calm, commanding, echo down the corridor. "The threshold stands ready." "Begin." Then came Hartwell's reply, low and trembling with anticipation. "Fifth key, turn." The humming deepened into a bone-rattling thrum, and every mirror in the house shivered, not with the movement of glass, but as if something inside them had stirred. The servants fled into the storm outside, leaving the great house behind them. None of them ever saw Hartwell, Eleanor, or the East Wing again. It was 3 days before anyone in the village found the courage to approach the Hartwell estate again. The storm that had rolled in on the night of the ritual had not behaved like any storm they knew. It didn't move across the moors. It lingered, swirling directly over the mansion, as if chained to it. Lightning struck in eerie silence, jagged forks that illuminated the windows for fractions of a second, revealing shapes inside that did not match the layout of the rooms. When the clouds finally broke, the air smelled wrong. Not of rain, but of something scorched, something ancient. The group who went up the hill found the estate gates wide open. The gravel drive was littered with shards of glass, though none of the windows appeared broken. The great oak doors were ajar, and the moment they stepped inside, they knew the house was dead. No voices, no creak of wood, no wind through the corridors, just an oppressive quiet, as though the very air had been pressed flat. The east wing was sealed. The hallway that had once led to it was gone, replaced by a smooth expanse of wall, the plaster still damp as if it had been freshly set. One man swore he could hear faint knocking from the other side, but when he pressed his ear closer, the sound seemed to come from behind him. Every mirror in the house was cracked, not shattered, but split in a perfect single line, as though they had all been struck by the same invisible blade. In the library, they found Hartwell's chair pulled up to the desk, his notes spread neatly before him. The final page contained only a single sentence, written in a hand far steadier than any of his previous scrawls. 5 keys turned. The door will not close. There was no sign of Hartwell, no sign of Eleanor. That night, villagers reported a strange phenomenon. Anyone who passed the old mansion swore that if they glanced toward the upper floors, they could see their own reflection staring back at them, not from the windows, but from behind them, as though the glass inside still remembered something the house no longer contained. To this day, the estate stands empty. The east wing has no entrance, no windows, and no one dares break inside. Some say it's because the wall hides whatever's left of Hartwell and his 5th wife. Others whisper that the wall isn't hiding anything at all. It's holding something in.